I want to talk a little bit about Kinbote's specific diagnosis. Um, I will predicate this by saying I am not a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist. I'm a literary person, nor was Nabokov. So this is all going to be a layperson's, an educated liberal arts layperson's idea of these diagnoses, but the kind of general idea of these diagnoses that Nabokov himself seems to have. And one of Nabokov's biographers, Brian Boyd, is very committed to the idea, a specific diagnosis that that Kinbote has that bears up. So Kinbote is paranoid. There are moments of what we know as outright paranoia. He has paranoid delusions, including delusions of grandeur. You see in various ways the this includes his terrible fear for his life, though he's also at other points suicidal. There's that passage where he says, "I was for several weeks in great fear of my life." Um, where is it? The fantasy about Zembla, where he is a king and can do anything he wants. I'm sorry, it's line. It's page 95, lines next 62. He glasses often, almost nightly, throughout the spring of 1959. I had feared for my life. Solitude is the playfield of Satan. So beyond kind of Kinbote's rich fantasy life and self-indulgent fantasy life and the kind of illusionary glamour of his great mythical escape as king, there is also a person who is suffering, who's in terror, who's afraid he's going to be killed for no reason but psychiatric reasons. He also fears that Gratus has come to kill him rather than Judge Goldsworth, which is what we think, which is what most readers think has actually happened, to the degree that anything can actually happen in a work of fiction. Some of us talked in the discussions about narcissism, which is a mental disorder which has been on our mind a lot, part of a public conversation. Narcissism has been in the news because of our politics for years, and so we're primed to see that. Narcissism isn't quite this. Narcissists don't necessarily have they don't have these kind of florid delusions. They just have a kind of generally delusional view of their own value and self. They generally don't imagine themselves as like kings from other countries. They just imagine themselves as the most fabulous person ever. They don't have these kind of terrible fears for their life that Kinbote has. And most importantly, the narcissist is always the most wonderful person in the world. A narcissist is incapable of elevating somebody like Shade, where a paranoid can have a delusion of intense connection to someone famous who they're idealizing, etc. There are a lot of paranoids who are psychologically attached and believe they have a relationship with some famous person, celebrity. A lot of actors, especially a lot of actresses. Here, Kinbote has fixated on a famous elderly poet. It happens. There's a sad case of a graduate student who fixated on some Columbia professors years ago. This is kind of part of the course. It's not narcissism but paranoid delusion. The idea that Kinbote views Shade as more impressive than he is, which is correct, by a greater margin than he thinks, nonetheless is not something a narcissist per se necessarily does. One of the things that is presented as not symptomatic is Kinbote's homosexuality. Remember, in 1962, homosexuality is still glossed as a mental illness for reasons of homophobia and ignorance. Freud was deeply homophobic. Freud medicalized homosexuality as an illness, and has a concept of latent homosexuality, which we can't even talk about because it's something that doesn't even exist. It's like teaching you about phlogiston or other things from alchemy or astrology. Latent homosexuality is not a thing that bears out in any experimental way, the way narcissism and clinical paranoia do. Um, Brian Boyd points out that Freud, whose work Nabokov does certainly know, much as he detests it very vocally, Freud claims that paranoia is rooted in repressed homosexuality. If you can follow the Freud logic here, it's an illness that you have but don't know you have. It's repressed, not repressed homosexuality that you should get out and explore because it's your real identity, but something you have to repress and get out and then cure. Wow. So Freud's idea is that you're feeling you have the primary illness of homosexuality, but you've repressed it, and this comes out in the other way of paranoia. That is all total nonsense. It has no clinical bearing on anything. But Nabokov is like, well, the one thing a paranoid shouldn't be able to do is be super gay. But here is Kinbote, who is paranoid and not at all repressed in his homosexuality. He might have to hide some things around new why. He might be on the down low in various ways because of the mores of American society in 1959. And in his fantasy life, Zembla is super queer friendly and he could get all the boys he ever wanted and all the women he didn't want. This is actually meant to be incompatible with his paranoia in psychoanalytic terms, but Nabokov doesn't believe Freud on this. He also doesn't seem to be presenting homosexuality per se as necessarily an illness.